Our story begins in a faraway place, a very long time ago. But it began not so long ago as to be the very start, for the beginning was long before even this. Because in the very beginning God created the world, and He created a man and a woman in such a way as to be flawless reflections of Himself, and they blazed with His brilliant light. His light was theirs. His story was theirs. But instead of remaining as reflections of the one who had made them, these people chose to cast a new light, their own. Suddenly they came to discover that, like the moon that hung hauntingly in the night sky above them, they had no light of their own. Removed from the perfect light that brought life to all things, the world was shrouded in shadow. God looked upon the darkened world with a broken heart. His creation had traded light for darkness. They traded His story for their own, and God knew that their story would end only in tragedy. In His great love, God could not allow this to happen. He set a new story into motion, a story that would parallel the one that man and woman had brought into being, but a story that would once more restore hope. A story that would end in a very different place than the one that humankind had set into motion. And as a part of this story, God raised up men and women, and an entire nation whom He called His own. And on these people He once more cast His light, that His light might once more be reflected into the world. But the light that was reflected was not what it had once been. His light was the same light, but their reflection was not the same. God's light reflected through His people was dimmed and dirtied. And so God promised that a day would come when this would change. He promised that one day His perfect light would enter the world again, that the storyline He had set into place would take an unexpected and delightful twist. Despite difficulty, God's people held on to His promises and His presence among them, and they knew what it was to have joy. They waited for God to pour His light into their world, to satisfy their hopes, to finally fulfill their joy. But the longer they waited, the more the promises of God seemed distant and forgotten, far removed from the life they were living. And the light of God reflected through them became so dim that it seemed it might be lost and forgotten. And many began to wonder, will we ever have joy? And that is where our story truly begins. Because joy was coming, but it would turn up in the most unexpected of places. Its whispers would be heard by a ragtag assembly of men, outcasts, huddled on the windswept hills outside of a tiny Jewish town. Hundreds of miles away, its glimmers would be seen by a league of scholars, foreigners who gazed into the mysteries of the sky. But first, its promise would be heard in a tiny and isolated town by an ordinary young girl. Hope was on the horizon. Change was coming. A journey toward joy was beginning. But joy often comes as a surprise. Nazareth was a city like any of the small cities that littered the dusty landscape of Galilee. As a town, it was distinct only in its lack of distinction. Mary, too, was like any girl in the town. She was young and pretty, and she would soon be married to Joseph, a carpenter who lived just a little further toward the center of the village. Thoughts of her swiftly approaching wedding were surely what consumed her mind as she stood in the doorway of her parents' tiny home, gazing out over the valley. She could not have known that an unexpected adventure would drive her over the hills in the distance, toward great heartache, but also great joy. As the sun set in the west and the evening settled in shadows upon the city, the night turned to inky darkness. All at once, Mary woke with a start, bolting upright from her mat laid out on the floor. Her eyes burned against a brilliant light, and she closed them tightly. It made no difference. Pushing herself up against the wall, she cowered there, until a voice spoke.
Mary, you needn't be afraid.
The angel told Mary that she had found favor with God, and that she would give birth to a son. But Mary was confused. How could she have a baby since she was still a virgin? With great patience, the angel explained that through a miracle of God she would be with child, and that the son she would bear would be the Son of God. She considered this for only a moment before answering the angel.
My life belongs to God, and I am his servant. May this all come to pass.
A moment later, the angel was gone, and the night was still. Mary's heart began to pound. Could it be true? After all this time, was God finally fulfilling his promises? Mary felt the first flutters of something, and in the quiet of the night, her voice broke into song, into rejoicing. Something was on the horizon. With the first signs of dawn, Mary raced to find Joseph. As her story poured out of her, she watched his face turn from worry into disappointment, and finally into a cold resolve. He backed away from her a step at a time, saying nothing. How could he be expected to believe that this baby had not been conceived in some shameful way? And then he was gone, leaving Mary standing in the street alone. Joseph's plan was to end their engagement quietly, but that would be difficult in such a small town. Then, one night, heaven visited the city of Nazareth once again. Joseph, as he lay sleeping fitfully upon his mat, encountered an angel in his dream. The angel told him that he should not be ashamed of Mary because, in fact, everything she had told him was true. As he awoke, relief flooded Joseph's heart, but he also knew that their tiny village would not understand. They wouldn't believe, just as he hadn't believed. Nazareth was a town of only a few hundred people, and when Mary began to show, news would travel quickly. There would be whispers. There would be shameful looks and barred doors, and the coldness of isolation. But deep inside, there was something else coursing through Joseph's veins. He'd been visited by heaven. God's voice was once again speaking into the world, speaking into his world and Mary's world. Joseph looked from his window and into the night sky above, wondering what might lay beyond the stars, but also wondering what might be so close at hand. A few months later, and hundreds of miles away, other men would be looking into the same sky and considering those stars, but for a very different reason. This group of men were philosophers and scientists, learned men of great prestige and even greater power who looked to the stars searching for meaning and significance. But many nights, as the celestial wonder hung above, they found themselves hushed into silence, struck dumb by the great expanse and their seeming insignificance. On one such night, the silence was suddenly broken as one of the men stood and exclaimed, pointing wildly toward the west. There, hovering a little ways above the horizon, was a star unlike any they'd ever seen. As they squinted their eyes toward the west, they were filled with the excitement that always comes with discovering something new. But one of them was reminded of something very old, something he had read once, quite a long time ago. Turning away from the glow of the star, he dashed inside to the darkened library. Quickly lighting a lamp, he scoured the scrolls that rested in every corner, scrolls that contained the learning of hundreds of different cultures over hundreds of years. Then he found what he was looking for, an ancient text, a forgotten remnant from a people who had once lived as slaves in their empire. It was a prophecy that told of one who was promised. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. He wondered at the significance of these words and of the strange star that stood in the place where there had once only been darkness. His hands began to tremble as he sensed that the star was calling to them, but all he could hear were the sounds of the night and the blowing of the wind. A wind was also blowing outside the tiny town of Bethlehem, and its gusts whipped at the cloaks of a tiny band of shepherds huddled close together on a hill overlooking their flocks. Their eyes were adjusted to the dim light of the moon, and they could just make out the shapes of their sheep and the lamps of Bethlehem a few miles off in the distance. Suddenly, a light burst into brilliance before them, and it cast pure, white light all around them. They staggered backward in fear, and then a voice came from the light and said,
Don't be afraid. I've come not to terrify you, but to bring you great news. Joy has come into the world, and it is a joy that is for the whole world.
Then the angel told them where to find a baby, and that this baby was the one God had promised, the one who would reflect God's perfect light into the world. Suddenly the whole sky was filled with angels, and they lifted their voices in song. The shepherds were overwhelmed with the wonder they beheld, and then, all at once, the angels were gone. The only sound was the shepherd's own ragged breath. With astonishment, the shepherds looked at one another. Their eyes were full of questions, but each also held a glimmer of hope. Perhaps God had set into motion the plan he had promised. The angels had said that this was good news of great joy for all people. Perhaps joy would be possible again. For God's light had broken into the darkness of the world, and that light had surprised many unexpected characters in unexpected places. This great story that had been playing out since the beginning had just experienced an interesting and surprising twist. A new journey had begun. As Mary began preparing herself to be a mother, her heart burned within her. She had endured months of scorn as the judgment of her town was heaped upon her, but her heartache mingled with absolute delight that God was at work. She was at a loss to make much sense of it. One morning, news spread throughout Nazareth that Caesar Augustus, whose Roman Empire ruled much of the ancient world, had decided to take stock of all that was under his command. And so every man, woman, and child would be counted from the city of their ancestry. Joseph and Mary, their lineage derived from Bethlehem, loaded up a few of their belongings and the food they would need for the week-long journey. As they set off across the barren landscape of Galilee, Mary couldn't help but think that they were once again on an unforeseen path, one that would echo the discomfort, difficulty, and loneliness of the past 9 months. But deep within her was the familiar and exciting anticipation for what the future might hold. But Mary and Joseph were not the only ones who were crossing the deserts toward Bethlehem. By now, each of the wise men had seen and discussed the ancient words that had been unearthed, declaring that the arrival of someone of great importance would be marked by a star. When one of them had first mentioned the idea of following the star, the others had been incredulous, but hour by hour their scorn had melted away and had been replaced by something else. Too many nights had they sat gazing, wondering and theorizing. The star had caused hope to spring up in them. Hope that their musings might actually mean something, that the world might mean something, that perhaps that distant star that was unlike any other might mark the birth of a king who was unlike any other. And so they began a journey in search of a king who would be marked by a star, who would be marked by light. It was an arduous journey, through hostile terrain and treacherous kingdoms, over barren deserts and under star-filled skies. But the sparkling light of that one star held them transfixed and caused them to journey forward, hoping that they were not wise men on a fool's errand. In the wilderness outside Bethlehem stood a small group of bewildered shepherds. Just a moment before, there had been a whole host of angels filling the sky, but now they were gone. The shepherds' eyes had been filled with the light of heaven, and now the night seemed darker than any they'd ever seen. In the darkness, they began shouting and calling out to one another in excitement. Without discussion, it seemed that they were all in agreement. They would go to Bethlehem. Without waiting for their eyes to adjust or for the light of the moon to guide their steps, without giving thought to their flocks or the distance they had to cover, they began to run, setting their eyes on the dim, burning lamps of Bethlehem. Their hearts raced faster than their feet. Their breath came out in puffs and they inhaled the cold night air. But their hearts were warm with a kind of expectation, an anticipation that a long-awaited promise was coming true. And as their feet leapt over brush and rocks, their hearts leapt within them. It felt good for them to run as their running became their rejoicing. But only a few hours earlier, Joseph had been frantically running for a very different reason. Joseph hurried from place to place through the narrow streets of Bethlehem. The city was full of strangers and foreigners due to the census, and every room in every inn was full. The last few legs of the journey had been particularly difficult, as it had become more and more apparent that Mary would be giving birth in the next few hours. As Joseph pounded on door after door, he couldn't help the despairing thought that it felt as though the exclusion they had suffered in Nazareth had followed them to Bethlehem. At last, Joseph returned to the door of an innkeeper, whom he had spoken with earlier. The innkeeper hadn't any room in his inn, but he had offered the family a place in the stable, among the animals. Joseph, believing such accommodations beneath them, and not wanting his son to be born amid livestock, had moved on, hoping to find something better. But here he was, humbled and exhausted, knocking on that door once again. The wise men also found themselves at a door, but they were a far cry from the small town of Bethlehem and the humble door of an inn. The star had disappeared from the sky a few days prior, and they had lost their way. So they stood at the gates of a palace in Jerusalem and asked to see the King of the Jews who had been born. But their request was greeted with puzzlement and scheming looks. When their questions reached the throne of Herod the king, he was enraged. Who would dare call another king besides he? Could the Jews be plotting an uprising? He quickly called all his advisors and scribes, and he asked what they might know of this so-called King of the Jews.
He is to be great and mighty, my lord.
He's often called the King of Kings, my liege.
Prophecy says he will be born in Bethlehem, your majesty.
His advisors had provoked Herod's temper. How dare anyone challenge the authority of the great Herod? He would not let the Jews get away with this. He would crush this rebellion. Herod called the wise men to him and set a shrewd trap. He feigned interest in worshiping this so-called king and asked the wise men to tell them when he had been found. But Herod's heart was full of murderous intent. Leaving the palace in Jerusalem, the wise men headed in the direction Herod's advisors had pointed, onward toward Bethlehem, unsure of the road that lay ahead. As they stopped to rest for the night, each of them had a peculiar dream in which they were warned not to return to Herod, for his heart was full of malice toward the one they sought. When they woke, it was still dark, but they found themselves awash in the glow of the star once more. It had returned. In the slumber of the night, they had encountered something miraculous and were beckoned once more by that star. In the silence of that night, they felt the assurance that they were journeying towards something wonderful. But all was not silent in Bethlehem, as a few disheveled shepherds went racing and shouting through the dark streets. They had been searching every stable and peering in every manger for some sign of a baby. At first there had been no questions, no hint of a doubt, but as the minutes dragged into hours, they began to wonder. Had they dreamt it? Had they misunderstood? Lamps were being lit throughout the city as they continued to search and shout. Finally, they came to an inn on the outskirts of town, and the innkeeper called them. He asked them what they were looking for. In between great gulps of air, the shepherds began to explain about the angels and the light and what they had been told. The innkeeper held up his hand to silence them.
Shh! There was a baby born in my stables this evening. Perhaps he's the one you're looking for.
With hopeful eyes, the shepherds looked from one to the other and then dashed off in the direction the innkeeper had pointed. They could not have known the magnitude of what they were about to witness. The night had been a long one. The cold had crept into the corners of the stable, and fear had crept into the hearts of Mary and Joseph. In a foreign city, with no family, on the floor of a stable they faced what lay before them. They faced the part they had agreed to play in God's story of bringing joy into the world. When the story God had written for his creation first twisted toward tragedy, God promised that the storyline would be rewritten. He promised that the light he shined upon the world would once more be restored and would be reflected through a perfect being. And in a stable in Bethlehem, that being came into being. And with the first signs of morning light, joy broke like dawn upon the earth. As Mary and Joseph gazed into the face of this child called Jesus, their hearts swelled with happiness and pride that is known to all fathers and mothers. But there was also a dawn breaking in their own hearts, a dawn of joy. For as they gazed upon this baby, they knew that God's miraculous plan had been set into motion. The storyline of all creation had just taken a radical turn. As the shepherds finally stumbled bewildered into the stable, they also looked upon the face of this child. And as they considered all that had happened over the course of the past few hours, their hearts broke open with joy as well. For hope had just come into the world. God's promise had been fulfilled. Now all of creation and their very own lives could look forward to being restored, to being remade, to finding their ends in the end of the story God had planned all along. Many months later, the wise men too would finally end their journey and come face to face with the king they'd been seeking all along. And while their minds must still have been full of questions, unable to imagine how the work of reversing the tragic storyline of the world could be accomplished by an infant king, their eyes were filled with the light of joy, for the king, the hope for the world, was among them. Mary and Joseph had braved a difficult journey, but through obedience they had unearthed joy. The shepherds had been overcome by the power and wonder of heaven, and by abandoning everything they'd known, they had found joy. The wise men had allowed their curiosity to turn into something more, and in seeking truth, they too discovered joy. And though each of these people were separated by geography and nationality, and some even by time, their lives intersected in the person of Jesus. Even today, some of us may come by obedience, some by abandon, and some by seeking. But all of us can discover joy in Jesus. Our lives, too, can intersect with His. For His promises tell us that there is hope for our lives and for the world in which we live. His presence among us, once again reflecting the true light of God, makes those promises possible. But the stories of those who gathered in the stable did not end that night. The wise men would return to their homeland and would be faced with the task of explaining why they had traveled hundreds and hundreds of miles to see a supposed king who was but an infant. But the way they saw the world and the way they viewed the stars that hung above had been drastically changed, and in that they would find great joy. The shepherds would return to the desolate hillsides of Bethlehem and would try to collect their sheep once more. As they returned to their daily lives, they would tell anyone who would listen about what they had seen, and as they recounted their stories, they would discover hope anew and find joy. Mary and Joseph would never be the same. For their entire lives, their child would mystify and surprise them, and in the end, they would suffer great heartache and sorrow. But in knowing that they'd had a role in bringing about God's plan, and in the truth, life, and forgiveness that their son's short life would bring, they discovered joy. Even the world was not immediately changed. In the coming months and years, there would be great pain as Herod, in his jealous search for this king of the Jews, would result in the deaths of thousands of young children. And the great difficulty, tragedy, and sorrow of our world continues to play out even today. For the reality of life is that the world in which we live is still broken. But we are finally able to see the truth that in all things, the promises and the presence of God remain. He is restoring creation. He is reorienting us. He is redeeming the world. He is writing a new story and inviting us into it. When we find ourselves lost, lonely, and overcome by the world that races and rises up around us, there is joy in the promise that in Jesus, we are not forgotten. Our God sees us. When we feel that we are braced against the world, suffering the biting cold and gusting winds of all that come against us, there is joy in the promise that in Jesus, we are not powerless. Our God is for us. When we feel abandoned, shamed, and broken by the ones who have loved us, there is joy in the promise that we are not alone. Our God is with us. For the story God began after the fall took a great and wonderful turn with the birth of Jesus. Even now we can see the clues and whispers that point to the wonderful ending He has in store, and in that we find joy. Because joy is seeing the world for what it really is, seeing it with all of its brokenness, but also seeing its potential for redemption and finding reason to rejoice. This is good news of great joy for all people. Centuries ago, a proclamation changed everything. "2,000 years later, the proclamation still resounds throughout creation, Jesus has come, and he still changes everything. He awakens hearts. He sets captives free. He renews purpose. He reorients lives. He restores marriages. He offers abundant life. He leads people to truth. He reveals the one who sent him. He binds up the brokenhearted. He heals the sick. He gives grace to the guilty. He gives hope to the hopeless. He gives rest to the weary. He gives strength to the weak. He invigorates the mundane. He comforts the lonely. He hears the desperate. He lifts up the defeated. He redeems the broken. He saves those who call on his name. And he is with us. Today we join the angels' song and declare the good news that is for all people. Joy is here.